We think ASRock lied to our faces about the cause of death for CPUs installed in its, as internet commenters call them, Murderboards. Previously, ASRock attempted to tell the internet that it might be PBO killing CPUs rather than its motherboards directly. There's also evidence that they aren't paying for some user shipping to cover defects, as they promised they would do when we asked them. And based on panicked and scrambled BIOS updates, it appears that they may have misrepresented the role of VSOC and the current limits in its relatively widespread failures of AMD 9000 series CPUs in ASRock motherboards. Now, this issue is not happening for the majority of users, but it's happening to more people than is acceptable. And there's really been no answer for about 9 months now for ASRock. So it's been 9 months of failures for ASRock's self-immolating motherboards that seemingly can't stop killing AMD X3D CPUs. The board wired up to probes that you're seeing is from a viewer. This motherboard has killed once, and we think it can kill again. And we've spent the last 5 weeks testing this murder board from ASRock to see if it'll return to the scene of the crime. That'd make it a serial murder board. The cause of failure is still unknown, but the result of it is consistent. CPUs often end up looking like this, or this, or this. Sometimes with damage that only amounts to some charring on the pads, other times with full-on meltdowns and burnouts. And for testing today, we're using a mix of software analysis, hardware info, and external analyzers like this logic analyzer that hooks up to probes. It's got 16 channels to the back of the motherboard where we can use it to read VSOC, the current, the various voltages on different rails like VDDIO_mem, for example, vCore, whatever else we might want, and try to see if any of that gets us to an answer. And we have a ton of results from it to go through today, and hardware info results, including testing entering sleep states, exiting sleep states, entering Hibernate, going from sleep to Hibernate, rapid load cycling with single-threaded workloads, and ultimately we're not able to replicate the problem. But we know it's there. And we have a lot of data to go through today. This is a real thing, all right? This is one of those things they're gonna be like, he's crazy, he's lost his mind, he's chasing ghosts. And first of all, yes, I am. The ghosts are in the motherboard because it killed the CPU and it's trapped in there now. And secondly, it's a real problem. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna publish everything we've found for the most part, put it all out there. Hopefully this helps kind of narrow community discussion, or maybe someone can connect some dots that we weren't able to find. If you've been really monitoring this, you've been affected by this multiple times or something, we'll put it out there. And you can thank our viewers who supported us in the black market documentary, the GPU smuggling documentary we did through our crowdfunding campaign, for making it possible for us to take a loss on this piece, because that's what we're gonna do. This was a huge amount of time and equipment expenses, and we do not have an answer, but we have a lot of really cool information that's useful and hopefully educational and may again narrow the scope. ASRock and AMD are both still troubleshooting this problem, so it's maybe not a surprise that no one has an answer yet. All right, let's get into the testing for the murder boards. Before that, this video is brought to you by ID Cooling and the frozen A720 cooler. The A720 air cooler performed well in our testing last year. The A720 is a relatively high-end, dual 140mm air cooler with 7 heat pipes. We found the use of larger fans can be beneficial to acoustic performance given the thermals, although you'll want to check your case for compatibility given the taller nature of the cooler and its fans. ID Cooling uses an all-black look for its A720 and includes mounting hardware for all modern sockets. Learn more at the link in the description below. All right, so this is such a needle in a haystack that ASRock needs AMD's help investigating it from what we understand, and they don't have answers yet. So take this video for what it is, which is an investigation to the best of our abilities over the last 5 or so weeks, plus compiling a timeline over the last 9 months, plus the previous interview to throw darts in the dark and try and hit the dartboard that is literally only the bullseye. That is what we are trying to do today, and hopefully there's something here that can advance the understanding of the issue. We just don't want to set the wrong expectation. We don't have an answer today as a specific cause, but there's a lot to learn here, and it is pretty fun to look into. There's a lot of mystery behind this problem as well, which makes it pretty interesting. Some background. Previously, we interviewed ASRock leadership on the issue, and we were told under no uncertain terms that...
But the CPU is just not working.
So is that an AMD issue? AMD CPU issue?
No, we're not saying AMD issue. We found that it's related to our BIOS setting. One of our BIOS settings, that's a PPO settings, the precision boost drive. And more technically, we adjust some settings, majorly 2 settings in that PPO.
Okay.
One is a thermal design current, stands,
TDC.
TDC. Yeah. EDC stands for electric design current. we found that our original value of these two parts may be a bit higher.
Okay.
So now with our new BIOS 3.25, we lower the PPO settings with these two values, and we believe it can solve the problem. But we think that VSOC has nothing to do with this problem. In this BIOS, we refine this PPO settings, and we believe it can solve the issues.
Okay. Is ASRock paying for the shipping both ways?
Yes.
In the time since, viewers reported that ASRock made them pay for shipping. ASRock updates suggest that it thinks actually VSOC may be problematic, and they didn't really change EDC and TDC, but they did change PPT and change VSOC. Part of the challenge here today is it can take months to manifest an issue. So we have over 200 hours of testing in this board. It could be a sample size thing, but we know this board has killed a CPU before, so that's why we've invested so much time into this one, plus by the logic analyzer. And again, you can thank our black market AI GPU smuggling supporters, the documentary supporters on the site, for making this possible, because we are going to take a loss on this. And if you would like to help out as well, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one of these t-shirts, the Blind Eye t-shirts, which seems extremely suitable for ASRock right about now. Anyway, here's the timeline over the last 9 months. There's been a string of ASRock and 9800 X3D issues that users have continued reporting since January. They're still happening. 6 failed BIOS updates later, and unfortunately, ASRock doesn't seem to be any closer to identifying a root cause. Early on, the company claimed that it was a boot issue, making processors appear dead when maybe they weren't. Then ASRock, quote, found debris, end quote, in a failed system socket, implying user error and even stating, quote, the release of BIOS 3.20 is not related to the CPU damage issue. All BIOS versions, including earlier iterations, will not cause CPU damage, end quote. That is a very clear statement. Except for one problem. The debris was coming from inside of the house. The original owner later clarified that the debris was actually melted pin pads caused by ASRock's motherboard failure, which puts it back on ASRock. In May at Computex, ASRock told us PBO causes the issues, pointing out TDC and EDC. Now ASRock's decided that actually something is related to VSOC, with its August 29, 3.40 BIOS update stating, quote, adjust VDDCR_SOC voltage parameters, enhances CPU operating stability, end quote, and its new BIOS offering a, quote, fixed voltage setting, end quote, for SOC. It's encouraging that ASRock is, in theory, investigating this and trying to fix it with BIOS updates. But after a certain number of failed hotfixes, we feel like ASRock's just throwing anything at the wall to see what sticks. So ASRock hasn't solved it yet, and when we were speaking with some of ASRock's partners off record, including system integrators and also some people at AMD familiar with the matter who couldn't go on record, our understanding is that ASRock has the highest failure rate when normalized for market share for its motherboards. So this does appear to be a problem. We're going to be discussing EDC, TDC, and PPT a lot during this video because that's what ASRock told us it was going to address back at Computex when we showed up unannounced and interviewed them on the show floor. And we wrote an article back in 2019 that defines these. They haven't changed much definitionally, and so we'll refer back to that. At least the changes aren't relevant here. So just to get you familiar, PPT is package power tracking. This is the allowed socket power consumption. Raising the PPT limit can help in heavily threaded scenarios where package power hits the limit if one is hit. TDC is the thermal design current, which defines the maximum current in amps that can be delivered by a specific motherboard's voltage regulator configuration in thermally constrained scenarios. EDC is electrical design current, which is the maximum current in amps that can be delivered by a board's voltage regulator configuration in the peak or spiky conditions for short periods of time. Now, raising the limits does only that. It raises limits, not what it runs at. So if you type in 1,000 amps for the current limit, it's not going to run the CPU at 1,000 amps. It'll just limit it there, because if it ran it there, you'd have a nuclear reactor in your house, and we already have enough 12-volt high power in the world. But what this can do is, in theory, boost or extend the time at which the CPU runs at an elevated clock, a higher clock speed, as a result of the limits being lifted. What it won't do is push it beyond what it's already capable of running at based on the configuration in the board. Even with liquid nitrogen, when I've done liquid nitrogen overclocking streams in the past with 16-core parts, we cannot get them to hit 1,000 watts, for example. So a PPT limit that high won't make it suddenly dangerous, won't make it run at that. All right, getting into the test and the test setup. Our viewer had a failure that we agree was likely caused by the motherboard or by the CPU. One of the two was the failure, we think. This is a good candidate. We bought the board from him, and the user said this, quote, it was powered on at least 8 to 14 hours a day, usually 5 to 6 days a week. I did have hibernation and sleep enabled after 15 minutes of inactivity, and it would be in sleep mode overnight when away from the PC. rarely powered down completely, end quote. Today we're going to be going over these different hypotheses and tests from the internet and also what we think. One is why we think ASRock lied about PBO, so we'll show you that. Another one is new leads and user updated reports on some testing options, including S3 and S4. We'll also be going over our results from ASRock's BIOS 3.40. That's later in the video. We're starting with 3.15 versus 3.25. That features a new SOC fixed voltage, as they call it, setting. And then finally, we'll wrap up by examining sleep states and recapping anything else that stood out to us as problematic or potentially abnormal in our testing to put it all out there. Maybe someone can do something with it. I can't promise we're going to look at this again, but we will certainly try. This is incredibly expensive to do because, again, without a clear target of what to go for, it's my instruction to the team, or when I'm testing it, it's basically, I guess we'll just test everything. And that takes a long time. So we'll try, it's just we would need a really firm lead and direction to go down the path of trying to test something. All right, so bench components. We used a 9800 X3D. That seems to be the most common for failures. Our viewers, ASRock B650 Steel Legend Wi-Fi that killed his CPU, DDR5 6000 Kingston RAM that's on the motherboard qualified vendor list, a Thermaltake Tough Power GF3 850 watt power supply, so not particularly good, but it's fine, and then a mix of parts we had lying around for the rest. We assembled all of this using an open frame vertical test bench, and then that allows us to hook into both sides of the cap so we can get a ground and the actual voltage. The primary advantage of the Salier Logic Pro 16 logic analyzer we bought is that this can monitor the system's activity in power off state, sleep, hibernate, when the system's turning on or turning off. Hardware info can't do that because the system's not on, so it can't do anything. We sent this out for peer review from a couple people in the industry as well. Most of them we can't name, but we can name Buildzoid from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, who took a look at this, provided some additional theories for further testing, and basically helped us run QC on it. So thanks to Buildzoid. We'll link him below as well. We'll start with testing ASRock's claimed so-called fix of PBO. We'll test BIOS version 3.15 versus 3.25, which came out at the same time we interviewed ASRock leadership. When we began testing months ago, the last advice from ASRock was that failures were caused by TDC and EDC boosting too high with PBO. Although ASRock acknowledged PBO's ability to kill CPUs in our discussion, it failed to share this information in any of its own ASRock press releases, at least at that time, despite previous updates regarding the dead CPUs receiving announcements. These charts will show Hardware Info 64 data to get us started. We'll start with the TDC and EDC changes from BIOS 3.25. We'll get to 3.40 later. This chart compares the average TDC and EDC under a fixed load between BIOS 3.15 and BIOS 3.25 that was supposed to restrict those values. Again, the reason for doing this particular one is because this is where we left off in our discussion with ASRock, and we want to validate what they said has any truth to it. These averages were taken with PBO enabled. That's because ASRock claimed the failures stemmed from PBO. So we ran a load and took the values after 5 minutes of steady state, which is when TDC and EDC stabilized at their max values. From BIOS 3.15 to 3.25, which is the one that they shipped alongside our interview, TDC technically increased from its prior 112 amp average to its newer average of 112.6. But 0.6 amps of difference is definitely not only within the margin of error, but also could be accounted for by expanding or shrinking the averaging window, making them functionally equivalent results. EDC followed a similar trend, increasing its prior average of 114.6 by 0.64 amps, or less than 1% in its BIOS update to 3.25. This is not an actual change. These numbers would normalize if we ran this a million more times, so really no difference here. These results contradict ASRock's claims to us back in May. ASRock stated with absolutely no uncertainty that it had configured the limits too high, but at least in this testing, the BIOS that was supposed to fix them produced basically the same values for both TDC and EDC. And again, this is taken at face value that they thought it was PBO related, even though plenty of people had failures without PBO. These values aren't the limiting factor for the CPU's behavior here. And as for limits, limits only limit things if those things are operating at the limits, and realistically, these CPUs aren't going to push that high. ASRock changing these values won't affect performance the way they claimed it would. Again, as an off-record AMD engineer said to us, quote, PBO being the cause is bullshit. TDC and EDC can be anything, end quote. Just to make sure ASRock maintained similar performance across all the BIOS revisions, we also ran some quick benchmarks for CPU performance and frequency. Because Expo and Expo with PBO saw the biggest deviation in limits, we ran the performance test against those settings. CPU PPT and watts via software measured the same in all tested BIOS versions, or close enough to be considered the same, because again, this is the actual PPT, not the PPT limit. This test looked at average all-core CPU frequency across a Blender workload. In this one, all of the Expo and Expo plus PBO results produced the same average frequency. There's no change to performance here. We also ran Cinebench single-threaded workloads to evaluate the maximum single-threaded frequency per interval on average. Across all revisions, it was the same. There was no loss or improvement in performance across the different BIOS revisions we tested. So we continued the search, and as we continued searching for changes between the BIOS versions, we put together this chart, illustrating ASRock's adjustments to PBO with its TDC, EDC, and PPT limits from BIOS 3.15 to 3.25. While not explicitly given, we calculated these values using TDC and EDC values in relation to their limits reported as percentages in hardware info, and we found the PPT limit from a CPU-Z-generated report. ASRock's TDC limit remained at 180 amps for both BIOS versions, despite the company claiming that it would be reduced in 3.25. In 3.25, ASRock's EDC limit with PBO enabled was reduced by 10 amps to 240 from its previous 250 amp limit in 3.15. PPT is the third value affected by PBO, but it's the only setting that ASRock didn't explicitly mention in its interview with us when it told us about the PBO changes. Despite not mentioning PPT in our discussion, ASRock's PPT limit received the most significant adjustments from the company in its 3.25 update. ASRock's prior PPT limit with PBO enabled was 270% higher at 1000 watts and now is reduced to 270 watts in 3.25. Because it's a limit, this won't matter. Burning 9800 X3D CPUs weren't running at 1000 watts, obviously. Other vendors also run at or have run at 1000 watt PPT limit without ASRock's issues they're having. And also, just for the record, we've done liquid nitrogen overclocking with the 9800 X3D. Even in that situation, we weren't anywhere close to 1000 watts. So, the change here shouldn't matter, and we think it's strange that ASRock said its PBO issues were related to TDC and EDC, seeing as those limits are unlikely to affect the behavior in question, and they didn't really seem to change them, or at least not much in the one instance they did. More importantly, it seems like most of the user reports of failures didn't have PBO enabled at all, which would further reduce the relevance here. We're not really sure why ASRock started here. Maybe it was just a smokescreen to say that it changed literally anything, and defaulting to blame PBO would allow them to misdirect users or move people to AMD for assuming some fault, and it may make it sound less important in the mainstream for anyone who's like, well, I didn't have PBO enabled, so I won't be affected. We're not seeing what the reason is here. It's also strange they didn't mention PPT for the value change since that was the biggest one. So to us, this whole thing seems like a smokescreen defense from ASRock during Computex. Let's move on. Another change we noticed in 3.25 was related to SOC voltage. Remember, this was the same BIOS that ASRock told us was supposed to fix PBO values, which it didn't really change much, and the company said that it had nothing to do with VSOC. So, this chart illustrates that the update had something to do with VSOC, because SOC voltage is seen in 4 different configurations we tested for both BIOS versions, and there is a change. In BIOS 3.15, ASRock's default and PBO profiles SOC voltage appeared around 1.02 volts. When we applied Expo, SOC voltage increased to 1.19 volts. This is in line with what AMD's recommended behavior is for Expo and VSOC. In the newer 3.25 BIOS, SOC voltage maintained a steady 1.19 volts in all of its BIOS profiles, regardless of Expo's configuration. At the time, we couldn't make sense of these results, because ASRock said VSOC had nothing to do with any of this, and yet they changed the behavior for some reason. But after ASRock's latest 3.40 BIOS, we think the company tried to mislead the public from its actual issues when it cited TDC and EDC as causing the dead CPUs and denied the possibility of VSOC as a factor when one of the most significant changes we saw was to VSOC. Now, these numbers aren't dangerous, but the fact that they changed is noteworthy when ASRock had denied any impact from SOC voltage. Around this point in our research, ASRock released BIOS 3.40 with its release stating this, quote, memory P state set to disabled by default, improves memory compatibility and stability, end quote, and they said, quote, adjust VDD CR underscore SOC voltage parameters, enhances CPU operating stability, end quote. Now, operating stability is an interesting way to say decreases chance of exploding, but we're assuming that's why they said it. In ASRock's default BIOS configuration, SOC fixed voltage is disabled, and its LLC is set to level 3, or load line calibration. When Expo is enabled, SOC fixed voltage is enabled automatically and set to 1.2 volts. Tests included 4 configurations with 2 combinations each. Default with SOC fixed voltage manually enabled, default with it disabled, which is just default out of the box, Expo, which enables SOC fixed voltage by default, and then Expo with fixed voltage manually disabled. Here's what we found. The first thing we noticed is that the fixed voltage behavior does appear relatively fixed throughout the respective tests, despite some changes to the absolute voltage numbers. In BIOS 3.40's default configuration, SOC typically sat at around 1.09 volts, with occasional increases to 1.095. That's not important here. Enabling ASRock's new SOC fixed voltage setting in the BIOS decreased default's SOC voltage by about 70 millivolts, resulting in voltages between 1.015 and 1.02 volts, while still remaining relatively stable. If we enable Expo, SOC voltage experiences an increased, mostly steady 1.19 volts, regardless of whether SOC fixed voltage is enabled in BIOS. There are some excursions from a flat line, but we'd consider the 0.001 volt changes to be fixed. These are within measurement noise. The larger bump seen before 400 seconds lines up with a load change, but still remains fixed after readjusting for the new current and workload requirements. This is just an experiment and may not be representative of all workloads, however. Based on our observations so far, default and default with fixed voltage produce a change in the hard VSOC number, but not the behavior, and the hard change didn't exit safety. For Expo, with and without fixed voltage, we saw both about the same voltage and the same behavior. In trying to understand why any of this seems relevant to ASRock, we remembered our own interview with ASRock and the Tech Yes City VSOC video predating this update by a few months for both of those. It's possible that adding this fixed voltage option was a response to the discussion these videos created in the community, even though it doesn't appear to modulate behavior significantly or perhaps at all in at least this particular test. Now, it might modulate behavior in other tests. There's millions of combinations. We chose one. But from what we're seeing, it doesn't really seem to do that much. So the search continues for something that changed, that matters. As for SOC Current, in the default configuration, SOC Current ran at 10.8 amps for this workload and for 380 seconds before falling to 8.7 amps. The decrease in current is related to the workload and not relevant to what we're testing here. Default with fixed voltage followed a similar pattern, but with lower current, hitting 9.8 amps during the heavier part of the workload. Once again, both Expo and Expo with fixed voltage produced nearly identical results. Both of these test runs started with SOC current at around 13.7 amps. In this test, we don't think the fixed voltage adjustment would have any impact on CPU longevity, as it doesn't appear to change the behavioral patterns. However, there are infinite combinations again of software and hardware, and it is possible ASRock was addressing some other spurious behavior that this test doesn't trigger. So it's not fully conclusive without more software and more testing. There may be a different trigger for ASRock's change. We're not seeing what is supposed to matter here. We think if ASRock considered this to be a critical prevention mechanism for failures, though, the company would automatically enable it as default in their BIOS settings. But they don't. So it doesn't seem that important. During Computex, we spoke to an engineer from one of ASRock's competitors who told us that he believed the VSOC fluctuations Tech Yes City observed, which that was a new video at that time, were normal. He didn't think that would be the problem and said that pretty much everyone sees those. So if that's the case, it would further support that even if ASRock's new fixed voltage setting keeps SOC voltage static, it wouldn't likely have any real impact on CPU longevity. At this point, our objective became trying to reproduce a failure specifically, and so we swapped the GPU to use more PCIe lanes. We replaced the RAM with a 1.4 volt DDR5 6000 Expo kit to increase the VDDIO_mem voltage, and in BIOS, our only change was enabling Expo. Based on the reports, we wanted to start by examining the CPU's power consumption during sleep states, but unfortunately, we weren't able to log those in hardware info. So we tried a few different locations for where we wanted to measure through the logic analyzer. We ended up choosing vCore, VSOC, vmiscellaneous, and VDDIO_mem with real-time visuals of what was happening on the board. Inherently, due to CPU socket impedance and vdroop, the measurements from the back of the motherboard will be a little bit higher than SVI3 TFN from hardware info. This is expected, and as we understand it, SVI3 sensor readings in the hardware info should be the most accurate. They can be manipulated, which is why it's good to have external, but they should be pretty accurate. And our external equipment should be able to read similarly to what the motherboard reports in hardware info for SVI3 TFN, and the external equipment is able to capture millions of samples per second, depending on the scenario, and we think that is well suited for this case. Now, we tried a few positions for for these probes. And whenever we mount probes like this to a motherboard, we sometimes get some colorful and vibrant commentary on where people think precisely they should be located. In the past, this has even stemmed from motherboard manufacturers who were unhappy with our findings of their products. Now, all we can say is this: for past content pieces like this, we have consulted with people like Buildzoid of Actually Hardcore Overclocking, Elmore of Elmore's Lab, and also Kingpin of EVGA formerly. And what we do for these measurements is what they do or what they have recommended to us. So we take recommendations and trust them from our more knowledgeable peers in different subject matter, like probing motherboard sockets, for example, or near the sockets. And they all have varying levels of different engineering experience and backgrounds on these types of subjects. So we go with what they say, and that's really the best that we're going to do here. The fact of the situation is this: short of attaching a wire to a pin in the socket, there's going to be some distance between the actual voltage measured and the current we might be measuring, and that is okay. Not having the most precise possible absolute number is okay in this situation because going to the MLCCs on the back of the socket, that's kind of the next best step. We are one step outside of that. We're still on the back of the board, not quite the back of the socket. And that's because the closer you get to the back of the socket, where it's the densest, you introduce more risk of shorting components. And so what we're doing is clamping these probes near the socket, and that gets us close enough. That comes on recommendation from people in the industry, and we can then compare the external capture from the Salier logic analyzer with SVI3TFN sensing and hardware info. And from there, we can look at the deltas. So what we're looking for today isn't the precise current or the precise voltage. What we're looking for is the difference or the change. For example, a large spike in the voltage during a sleep state change, that would trigger us to inspect that. And so at that point, if there's a large change or something, or a large delta, that would be a situation where we might decide to then go for the highest precision possible and either wire up to a pin or go to the back of the socket. But basically, if we really need to get the precision to get the exact voltage and current, then we can make that decision. You start wide, and then you narrow the scope and the search radius from there once we see if it's even worth narrowing the scope in on a particular subject. So that is our approach. We have some data for just how close that gets us as well. This chart compares the averages of our external and software readings from a test we used to record both simultaneously. We have to downsample this particular external capture by an aspect ratio of 1 to 1,562,500 just to get the logic analyzer's values to correspond with hardware info 64. So we lost a lot of data in that process. We're going to show it later though. The logic analyzer typically reads between 30 and 50 millivolts greater than the CPU voltages provided by the SVI3TFN sensor reported by hardware info 64, depending on the CPU power rail. That's fine. We're mostly looking for spikes in the millions of rows from the logic analyzer, so again, that can be analyzed through the screenshots later. On average, our external measurements were typically greater than our internal software readings by 44 millivolts for SOC voltage, 36 for VDD_miscellaneous, making it the closest to its software reading, at least in terms of absolute value, and 47 millivolts for vCore, which was the largest absolute difference we saw between software and external measurements. None of these differences stood out to us as abnormal, and knowing the variances between the external readings and what the SVI3TFN sensor reported allows us to gauge the voltages better during the different power and sleep transitions that hardware info 64 wasn't able to capture. The first experimental testing we did with our new equipment was examining how the CPU power rails reacted to different sleep and power events. We can't see that with hardware info because the computer is asleep, so this is a great use case. We'll start with sleep then, since ASRock is the reason I haven't gotten much of it. When our system enters sleep from the Windows menu, VDD_miscellaneous, vCore, and VSOC all drop to 0 voltage, while VDDIO_MEMS voltage stays consistent around 1.4, where it remains throughout the duration of sleep. It makes sense that VDDIO_MEM would remain active in order to preserve the state of the system. By zooming in and narrowing VDDIO_MEM's y-axis, we found that this power rail experiences a ramp-up period with shorter distances in between the voltage peaks, followed by increased voltage fluctuations, or larger differences between its high and low peaks, once the system enters sleep, that is. Prior to sleep, VDDIO_MEM's high and low voltage peaks typically differed by 10 millivolts. Once in sleep, this peak-to-peak difference grows to around 35 millivolts, while voltages fluctuated between 1.394 and 1.429 volts. We spoke off record with an engineer at AMD and learned that these are expected voltages and unlikely to be related to ASRock's failure. So on to the next breadcrumb. This is what we observed when waking the system from sleep. In theory, wake from sleep should have the potential to be somewhat abusive on the CPU. As seen here, all the previously inactive CPU power rails jump to an initial 800 millivolts for half a second or so, before then beginning to stabilize at their typical voltages. As far as abnormalities go, we consistently observed this 2 millisecond VDDIO_mem voltage drop to 1.12 volts before returning to its steady 1.4 volts. This might be normal if nothing is happening, but it could be an issue. Whatever that issue is, we don't think it's related. It's more likely, though, that it would cause blue screens or instability on wake than failures of the CPU. It's a drop, not a spike, and the end result of that drop, if it's too low, might be that you just lose the system state and you can't wake the system, but that wouldn't kill the processor. We also noticed this temporary V-core spike, regularly peaking at 1.415 volts before stabilizing around 1.2 volts. Now, 1.415 is really no problem, especially when it's short and there's no meaningful amount of current going through the CPU. Even 1.5, and speaking with some engineers, should be fine if it's not really doing anything and it's just a blip while waking. So the mystery continues. Hibernate is next. Originally, it looked like all of the CPU's power rails decreased in voltage simultaneously. Zooming in closer allowed us to see that the voltages actually drop off in steps, which would be how power sequencing works, so that's expected. It starts with V-core and VSOC and is followed by VDD_miscellaneous and concludes with VDDIO_mem's slow descent. Intel would have a mirrored version of these behaviors for its own power rails, so none of these look like they'd cause a failure to us. Narrowing VDDIO_mem's y-axis once again reveals increased voltage fluctuations as the system transitions into Hibernate, or S4, meaning wider gaps between its high and low voltage peaks. Its previous 15 millivolt peak-to-peak difference grows to a now 30 millivolt gap. And for the final system event sleep state behavior we'll be going over, this is the transition from sleep to Hibernate. In sleep, only VDDIO_mem is active. As the system transitions to Hibernate, which is a setting you can configure based on time, if it's asleep for so long, it goes to a lower power state, the CPU ramps up on all power rails for 10 seconds as it writes a Hibernate file. This is necessary to preserve the system state and is why the Hibernate file can sometimes be many gigabytes large. Immediately preceding this ramp period, there's a half second when all the previously inactive CPU power rails suddenly jump from 0 to 800 millivolts. As these power rails increase to more stable voltages, we observe the same sudden VDDIO_mem voltage drop that we previously mentioned. During the ramp, we noticed that VDD miscellaneous maintains a mostly steady 1.13 volts. We also saw that V-core begins at 1.255, which is fine, drops to 650 millivolts, and then climbs up in steps until reaching a temporary 1.41 volts before steadying out between 1.14 and 1.22. Finally, VSOC holds a pretty consistent 1.232 volts. But once the Hibernate file is written, all CPU power rails, including VDDIO_mem, decrease to 0 volts. So for the next one, we needed CPU load cycling, and for this, I wrote an automated script to do one of the more abusive workloads that a CPU can perform on a system, which is to begin a lightly threaded workload, and then immediately kill it, and then begin it again. Now, normally, you would think that an all-core workload is the most intensive, but actually, from our understanding, a single-core workload that starts and stops rapidly is more abusive on the CPU itself. And this is actually something AMD uses for its testing. So, for what we're testing today, this puts more strain on the processor and tests stability better than all-core workloads. The script I wrote for this launches Cinebench single-threaded testing. We're just using R23 here. Doesn't matter which version. We need something easy to automate and reliable. And we run it until just before or right around when the first tile finishes rendering from one thread. We then kill the application immediately with just a task kill, and then we loop that and run it through as many loops as we want defined in our batch file. This shows almost 3 hours of capture at a high polling rate with the Salia logic analyzer. Nothing immediately jumps out at us. We ran tests like these overnight sometimes, so we're just looking at one sample. Zooming in to a 200-second window, you can see the pattern of load kill, load kill, load kill in the V-core line. It's definitely fluctuating as a result of this. Here's a 150 millisecond plot instead, so it's zoomed in even more. V-core spikes towards 1.2 volts, then drops below 1.0, then spikes again, and it repeats basically until we stop the whole test. Sometimes the drops are lower, and we didn't see any triggers at a dangerous V-core. VSOC would sometimes spike towards 1.24 volts, but this is not a deadly action. So we didn't come away with anything that looks like a CPU killer here. Once we got to this point, we kind of burned through our best leads, and so we started looking for new ones. And what we found was on the rack and data center side of things. So we went through user emails, and we started sorting through leads for ASRock rack deployments. One viewer informed us of abnormal failure rates that affected certain ASRock rack motherboards, specifically noting the B650D4U and its variants. Like the 9800 X3D issues, these failures appeared as systems suddenly showing a 00 code and no longer being able to boot, often after months of stable use. Another user reported, quote, out of 22 units installed, over 25% have failed with the dreaded postcode 00 error, end quote. Another had to replace 20 motherboards. And this user stated through machine translation, quote, we can confirm that we already have 42 defective B650D4U boards, end quote. Most of these issues were reported around the end of 2024. Around this time, German cloud and data center provider Hetzner was using motherboards in its systems that were custom built by ASRock. In January, Hetzner posted about ASRock motherboards, stating, quote, over the last few weeks, there have unfortunately been an increasing number of unexplained incidents with mainboards on a number of servers from these models, AX42, AX52, and AX102. After a detailed analysis of the incidents, which we did in cooperation with the manufacturer, it became clear that there is a design error on the main board for these models, end quote. This is pretty interesting because this is an enterprise solutions provider, not a random end user. So there's going to be a lot more consistency in the components that make up the systems and also in the method and use cases that they're deployed in. In July, Hetzner announced the completion of its mass exchange for affected motherboards, which spanned from February to July. The company stated, quote, servers that were ordered after January 9th, 2025 were not affected, end quote, although it's unclear if ASRock provided the replacement boards for Hetzner. Regarding the root cause, one user suggested, quote, from what we've learned from ASRock Rack, it was something to do with a vendor that was used for BIOS chips. They've since switched back to the original manufacturer. Impacted boards seem to be manufactured from Q1 to Q3 2024. They've been responsive regarding RMAs, and new boards seem to be problem-free, end quote. Now, BIOS chips are pretty easily swappable in the field. We've swapped BIOS chips in the past and they failed, but it's possible here that Hetzner's actions indicate that they were concerned about a more detrimental issue than previously suggested, and also they're a big enterprise business. It's possible that they just didn't want to deal with a potential reputational hit if the BIOS chip swap didn't fix it. So maybe showing some lack of confidence there in the fix. More recently, some ASRock Rack users are claiming the issues have resurfaced. As for the differences between ASRock's desktop and rack issues, most rack issues are fixed with replaced motherboards, and they typically occur with the 7000 series CPUs, so far at least. User reports seem to heavily align with 9000 series CPUs instead. Currently, there's no strong evidence to connect these two issues beyond ASRock just generally having a bad time right now. We won't spend much time on the rest of the emails, but to quickly recap some that went into our research, users reported failures occurring on BIOS 3.15, 3.20, 3.25, and 3.30, and we've recently seen some posts of 3.4 on the Reddit. Now, this is relevant because it showed failure reports continued even after the supposed fixes rolled out. One user reported BIOS 3.25 causing instability on his 7000 series CPU, and probably more than anything, we saw mentions of sleep states being a recurring factor in most of these failure cases, which is why we tested sleep states earlier in this video. This matches what our current test board's original owner reported, and that's why we bought his board and used it for the sleep state testing. We also received this email from a viewer claiming that ASRock made the customer pay for his RMA shipping, breaking the single commitment that ASRock made to us during our meeting. Is ASRock paying for the shipping both ways?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay. Now, this is to us the most unacceptable part of all of this, where ASRock stated that if there were a motherboard fault, that's their fault and not yours, they'd pay for shipping both ways. That's what we think is fair. If it's under warranty and it's the manufacturer's defect, not something you caused, they should be paying for the shipping because you don't have a functioning product. Our view is you should only have to pay to receive the product one time if there's a defect, and that one time is the first time you buy it, and other than that, they should be paying to ship it around the world if the product has a defect. So the fact that ASRock promised to us that it would cover shipping for legitimate defects from his customers, and then this user is reporting that they did not, that's a problem. And if you run into this, we want to know about it, because if this is widespread, it's something we need to be aware of so we can dig into it. And you can email rmarescue@gamersnexus.net. Next, we'll revisit the 9800 X3D fails Google form shared by Reddit user Ofasad. Since our coverage in March, the responses grew from 25 to over 280 reported failures at the time of writing this. This data will be biased against ASRock, as the form was primarily circulated on the ASRock subreddit. Additionally, users are more likely to be on a forum if they have a failure or a defect than if everything is working well. So this will also bias the data towards defects. Of the data collected, and focusing only on failures, we'll start with failures by motherboard vendor. 81% of the reports were noted as ASRock. 37 failures, or 13%, occurred on Asus boards. Gigabyte and MSI each made up about 2.5% of the failures. But again, this was popularized on the ASRock subreddit, so it doesn't really mean anything. An Asus guy having a problem probably isn't posting about it on the ASRock forum. We checked with an anonymous engineer at AMD to try and understand what the distribution of failures was. Our understanding from that conversation is that ASRock does appear to have a higher rate of failure than its competition, which is particularly noticeable because it is a lower volume than, say, Asus. Sorting by chipset, there were 103 B850 boards, 61 X870 and 60 X870E boards, 37 B650 motherboard users, and a combined 11 failures for X670E in terms of reported failures. In this sample, the ASRock B850i Lightning Wi-Fi was the single most common affected motherboard, with 32 failures. Now, that could be because they sold the most of them. Several X870 motherboards had 14 or more boards affected by failures, and there were very few B650E or X670E chipsets affected from the last generation. It's also less likely that these older chipsets would be affected presently, because they're older boards. The sampling bias, in terms of people reporting, would be in favor of their survival on this chart. Users who bought them a year or 2 years ago for a previous generation would have probably already gone through failures and replacements and are unlikely to still be monitoring these threads today. Of course, the board can socket 9000 series CPUs, but users of these boards are more likely already established with 7000 series, so there's some sample bias here that would bias towards the newer motherboards in general, the chipsets. We can't draw any meaningful conclusions yet from this data beyond the fact that it seems the chipset may not be relevant to the failures, seems to affect all of them in some capacity. CPUs have batch numbers that can be useful for tracking bad batches or particularly good silicon. Out of the 197 responses that included eligible numbers, we found 25 unique batches. The production dates range from the 41st week of 2024, or early October, to the 15th week of 2025, or early April, so far. Batch numbers are detailed on the CPU itself. Batch CF2449PGE had the highest total count of failures. CF2442PGY and 2443PGY were also both high in reported failure count. These are also sorted chronologically in our chart, with the number construction using the first 2 digits for the year and the second 2 digits for the week of that year. There may be other variables at play, such as the potential that some batches may have contained fewer 9800 X3D units if chip supply had been diverted elsewhere in a given run or something. Kind of comes down to how AMD precisely batches their orders. Almost 60% of the reported failed processors from users originated from one of 6 batches. Batch CF2449PGE from the end of 2024 currently has the most failures, with 28 of the reported, or 14% at the time of writing this. Just 3 other batches have upwards of 18 reported failures each, with the 4 making up a significant portion of the total failures. Now, the next place to check would be for commonalities between ASRock serial numbers. Out of the 114 ASRock users who included their motherboard serial number in the response, 84% of the motherboards stemmed from the same 5 serial number prefixes, and nearly half of the reports failed on motherboards starting with serial number HCM0XB1. We aren't sure precisely how ASRock constructs their serial numbers, so this may not mean anything. It's possible, for instance, that one serial number prefix spans multiple batches. Companies normally aren't transparent about this. We also noticed most users reported using either an AIO, or a high-end liquid cooler, or a high-performance air cooler, observing no CPU or motherboard damage, although 10 to 20 users did report tarnished pads or small scratches, depending on how you define those things. And we also noticed a lot of people mentioned using 1.4 volt Expo kits. The use of high-end liquid coolers would correspond with running at higher boost states for longer. It would enable precision boosting to propel the CPU to higher performance levels, so there's possibly a correlation here. That seems likely. Now, the high-end cooler would not cause the failure. It would just sort of enable it if that's the case. So this next section is just us putting out whatever useful information we have left. We're not sure that any of these go anywhere. Some of them could be different issues entirely, but it's us kind of saying, okay, here's the rest of some random findings. See if it does anything for anyone out there. So in multiple BIOS versions, we noticed that sometimes the systems would have trouble waking from sleep. We noticed that sometimes they would power off the monitor but would not enter sleep despite it being set and appearing like it was in sleep. It would sometimes wake from sleep but wouldn't power on the monitor, kind of the opposite issue. And we also saw that there were some reports of similar observations online from users. Now, sleep states have long been a problem in Windows and with the hardware that uses it, so this is not necessarily news. It could be totally unrelated, but just in case, we're putting it out there. Now, finally, for our least conclusive findings, despite VDD_miscellaneous_S5 being set to 0.75 in BIOS, we never saw voltage supplied to VDD MISC in any of the sleep states throughout testing. Running a Windows assessment for Hibernate performance produced these errors, stating, quote, BIOS initialization of the Hibernate assessment exceeded its threshold of 4 seconds, end quote, citing our time as 14.7. In the advanced AMD PBS, AMD firmware version tab in BIOS, we noticed our S3 image ID was 0. This might be normal, but we wanted to include it anyway. When comparing the hardware info system report from BIOS 3.15 to 3.40, the most significant change we noticed was the adjusted memory timings. And oddly, 3.15 didn't provide a value for CLDO VDDG. This could just be because the system retrained during boot, which is normal and expected, and it might have retrained at different subtimings. It could also be a result of ASRock loosening its timings intentionally to improve stability. And finally, one time we clicked on Hibernate in Windows and the mouse just stopped working. It dropped out. So it might be a separate USB dropout issue. Had to unplug it, replug it back in. Could be unrelated, but we'll throw it out there too. Now, due to the commonality of 1.4 volt Expo kits as we get into VDDIO MEM discussion, and due to how VDDIO MEM is an active rail when the system's in an idle state of some kind, we think our next testing plans might look into how ASRock's VDDIO_MEM implementation differs from other motherboard manufacturers. Now, we're not sure if we'll have the time budget to do that without firmer leads, so that would kind of just depend on what comes back after all this, and if anyone really knows something and points us in that direction. We would also be considering motherboards from different vendors for further comparison and testing. Ideally, we'd be able to identify significant design or power changes that the ASRock boards offer to then probe those versus their competition, specifically as it relates to sleep state and transitions to and from those states. But again, that is getting into a lot of testing with no clear direction. So we're only going down that path if there's something to point us there. Regardless, this wouldn't be ASRock's first issue with VDDIO. In November of 2024, ASRock removed its DDR5 high voltage option from several of its BIOSes, effectively capping its VDDIO_MEM voltages. In February this year, ASRock sent certain users unreleased BIOS versions to test in an attempt to resolve issues. One of these unreleased BIOSes that was privately sent to a user was called 3.18.MEM03, indicating incorrect VDDIO MEM voltages were causing issues. AMD has had some official statements as well. In its latest statement on the situation, it responded to Quasar Zone about burned CPUs, announcing through machine translation, quote, the issue is caused by some ODM BIOS not following the values given by AMD, end quote, seemingly throwing ASRock under the bus despite not naming its partner directly. AMD didn't mention any RMA-related information, and until we hear otherwise, we'd assume AMD will continue accepting RMAs for failed processors, even if they were caused by ASRock settings. Now, unfortunately, without a replication to match the problems, we're not exactly sure what advice is best to give to people who already have an ASRock board. If you don't have one and you're worried about it, then don't buy ASRock. And certainly those words should ring true enough where ASRock maybe gets its ass into gear and at least communicating properly with its customers, something that we pushed them on in our interview with them at Computex, and something we think they have failed to properly do in the time since, despite saying that they heard the feedback. So, without a replication, our only real suggestion maybe is that we don't think you should leave your system idle for extended periods of time or go into sleep or hibernate states. We don't know. That might be totally unrelated, but it's kind of like, look, you got to use your computer if you built it. And there's not a ton of things you can avoid doing. That's one of the few you can avoid doing if you're worried about this problem. Anything else, like if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And I guess you deal with it then, unfortunately. But we think the failures are stemming from something abnormal happening during extended low power states on ASRock boards. We're not certain. VDDIO MEM deserves maybe more of a look. And originally, we would have advised disabling sleep, which you may still want to consider. But we've also seen failures from systems with sleep disabled. So in short, who the fuck knows? We'll continue to monitor the situation as best we can. We'll be sure to give an update of if a failure happens on this motherboard that we've been testing, and we'll continue to test. We're also considering buying some other boards from different vendors for further testing and comparison. Ideally, we'd want to be able to identify any significant design or power differences that ASRock boards offer. But in the very least, for whatever it's worth, we do think this is an ASRock problem. The data does point towards ASRock for what we've collected. We've spoken to a lot of sources around the industry, SIs, and people at AMD we can't name. And from what we're hearing, it sounds like ASRock at least has a higher failure rate than is typical when normalized for market share. And so that alone should be enough to suggest that there's something here. It's just that we don't know what the it is. And so it's like, we tried the theories that are on Reddit. There's a lot of stuff we didn't publish as well. We put pretty much everything we thought would be useful out there, but we tried a lot of things that seemed like just total dead ends, and we omitted that. But anyway, we'll try and look back into it. So that's pretty much going to be it. The upside here is we got new equipment that we learned how to use. That's really cool. We have uses for this. Hopefully the data is useful to someone. And otherwise, we're going to let this system kind of do stuff continuously and see if it fails at some point, because a lot of the failures seem to be related to longer term use. We're at 5 weeks now on this, and in theory, another month or two should be about when a lot of people report failures. So we'll see if something happens. If not, then we're leaving options open. We'll keep an eye on commentary online, see if anyone has a really strong lead as to where to go next. Until that point, we have a couple other content pieces we want to work on, so we're going to switch away from this and work on those, but we'll keep monitoring to see if anything comes out of this. As far as we know, though, right now, ASRock and AMD both have not figured this out yet, and I think it's possible we could, but normally at least one of them would be closer to figuring it out before we do, for very obvious reasons, namely billions of dollars reasons. They have a couple billion reasons why they should be better at it than us, but we'll do our best, and we'll keep an eye on it. Thanks for watching. Hopefully that helps someone. In the very least, hopefully you learned something interesting. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net if you want to help support this type of work directly. This is incredibly expensive because of the time cost on it and the equipment cost. So we use your help on it as always. And thank you to our Black Market documentary backers for basically allowing us, through your support, to subsidize this with the fundraising from that, because that is what we did. So otherwise, go to store, grab the Blind Eye t-shirt, and we'll see you all next time.